The ad was a ghost, a whisper on the edge of the internet. It was posted on a job board for household staff so exclusive you needed 3 references just to see the listings. The details were sparse, but the compensation was loud. Live-in maid required for a private estate, secluded, discretion essential, generous salary and board provided, no questions asked. That last part should have been the first warning. No questions asked is never a good sign. It's a red flag. But my own desperation was a much bigger problem. I was drowning in debt, and my only consistent mail was an eviction notice. I saw the salary, the promise of a roof over my head, and I chose to see nothing else. The estate's address wasn't on any modern map. I had to follow handwritten directions sent by a courier, a route that wound hours away from the city, up roads that seemed to shed the 21st century with every mile. The car service finally dropped me at a massive wrought iron gate, flanked by stone gargoyles whose faces were worn smooth by a century of rain. Beyond the gate, a long drive snaked up a hill toward a silhouette that stabbed at the bruised twilight sky. Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just a house. It was a scar on the landscape. A gothic marvel of spires and shadowed windows that looked less like a home and more like a place where fairy tales go to die. My new employer, Count Leopold, met me in the grand foyer. The space was cavernous and cold, smelling of old stone, beeswax, and something else. Something faintly metallic and sweet, like old roses and forgotten pennies. He was a vision from another time, impossibly handsome, with dark hair that fell over a sharp, intelligent brow. His eyes were the color of a forest at midnight, holding an ancient, patient kind of stillness. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly silent. No footfalls on the marble floors. He just appeared. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He just smiled, a brief, sad curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his watchful eyes. He was, in a word, magnificent. And in another, terrifying. His voice was a low, cultured baritone that wrapped itself around the chill in the air. "Welcome to your new home," he said. And then he handed me the list. It wasn't printed on paper. It was a single sheet of thick, creamy parchment, slightly yellowed at the edges as if it had been waiting for me for a very long time. The script was an elegant, flowing cursive, written in an ink the color of dried blood. At the top, in a slightly more severe hand, it read, "The rules of this household." There were 5 of them. 5 simple sentences that felt like commandments. As I read them under the dim, flickering gas lamps, the cold of the manor seemed to seep right into my bones. These weren't suggestions. They weren't guidelines. They felt like the terms of a contract I had already signed without reading the fine print. The Count watched me, his face an unreadable mask of calm. "These are the only rules you need to concern yourself with," he explained, his voice as smooth as polished jet. "They are absolute, unbreakable. Your comfort, your safety, and your continued employment depend entirely on your adherence to them. There will be no warnings. There will be no second chances." My debt-ridden mind immediately started rationalizing. Rich people are eccentric, right? The richer they are, the stranger their demands. This was just the price of admission. The salary he was offering could clear my debts in 6 months. A year of this, and I could start over. The isolation? A blessing. I needed to escape the constant reminders of my failures. The strange, handsome count who glided instead of walked and spoke of unbreakable rules like they were laws of physics? Just a rich recluse with a flair for the dramatic. That's what I told myself. It's what I had to believe. I looked down at the list again. I was a maid. My job was to clean, to dust, to keep this monument to forgotten time from crumbling. The lives of my employers, their guests, their secrets, that wasn't my business. I was a ghost in their machine, paid to be deaf, dumb, and blind. I folded the parchment and put it in my pocket. I understand, I said, my voice sounding small in the vast hall. I won't be a problem. A flicker of something, amusement, pity, crossed his face. No, he said softly. I don't believe you will. My naivete was breathtaking. I saw a list of odd housekeeping requests and chose to ignore the truth screaming from between the lines. These weren't rules for a maid. They were a survival guide for living with a monster. And I had just promised to follow it to the letter. The first rule seemed the most reasonable of them all. Never enter the master's chambers before the stroke of midnight. Simple enough. A man like Count Leopold would value his privacy. I figured he needed solitude, or maybe he was just a very, very late riser. My duties were to the house itself, a sprawling labyrinth of over 50 rooms, most of them shrouded in white cloths like sleeping giants. My days were filled with the scent of lemon oil and the whisk of my broom on ancient floors. I started each morning in the east wing, where the sun would spear through grimy windows and light up dancing dust motes. I'd work my way through the library with its towers of books that smelled of vanilla and decay. The grand ballroom, where shrouded chandeliers looked like cocoons waiting for a spring that would never come. The dining hall, with a table long enough for a royal banquet, though I was only ever told to set a single place for dinner. The silence was the hardest part to get used to. It was thick and oppressive. My own footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, they were all startling. Sometimes I'd catch a flicker of movement in a mirror or feel a sudden cold spot in a warm corridor and tell myself it was just my imagination. I never saw the Count during the day, not once. The entire west wing, where his chambers were, remained as still and silent as a tomb. But as dusk began to bleed across the sky, a change would come over the manor. A sense of anticipation, a low hum of energy. And then, sometime after dark, he would emerge, always dressed impeccably in dark, tailored suits. We would pass in a corridor, and he would offer a slight, courteous nod, his dark eyes seeming to look right through me. A month went by, and a strange pattern emerged. The face that greeted me each evening was exactly the same as the one that had hired me. No new lines, no hint of fatigue. He had this flawless vitality that was a stark contrast to his decaying home. It was as if the house were aging for him. I remembered skimming old legends about vampires, how they are frozen at the age of their turning. I'd let out a nervous laugh in the empty kitchen. And yet, the question lingered. What if he wasn't aging because he can't? The old lore spoke of hidden sanctums guarded by strict rules, where the undead rested to maintain their power. The Count's chambers weren't just a bedroom, they were a sanctum. The rule wasn't about privacy. It was about protecting a secret state of being. He didn't sleep as we do. He rested. He restored himself. And whatever that process was, it was not meant for living eyes. One evening, I was polishing silver in a gallery down the hall from his wing. It was about 1:45. A faint sound, like the soft tinkling of glass, drifted from his door. Probably nothing, but my curiosity flared. My cleaning was done. The rule was specific: before midnight. In 15 minutes, I could go in. What was the harm in being a few minutes early? I moved down the hall, my shoes making no sound. I told myself I was just being efficient. As I reached for the brass doorknob, a wave of cold hit me. Not the normal chill of the old house. This was a deep, unnatural cold radiating from the door itself. A warning. It smelled of damp earth and that same faint, sweet, metallic scent from the foyer. My fingers hovered inches from the knob. The tinkling sound came again, followed by a low, guttural sigh that was not entirely human. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I snatched my hand back as if the doorknob were red hot. The first rule wasn't about politeness. It was a shield. It was protecting me from whatever was on the other side of that door. I fled down the hallway, my heart hammering. I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen, the warmth of the hearth a feeble defense against the chill deep inside me. For the first time, I wasn't just curious about what the Count was hiding. I was terrified of it. The second rule was, if anything, even more peculiar. Do not speak to guests of the house after dusk has fallen. At first, I just filed it under rich people are weird. The Count was a private man. When he entertained, he must want his guests' undivided attention. My role was to be invisible, a silent functionary, not a conversationalist. It was odd, but I was being paid not to ask questions. The guests were a curious procession. They never arrived in groups, always one or two at a time, in expensive cars that crunched on the gravel. They were artists, academics, philanthropists, men and women of note, their faces a mix of excitement and nervous awe. My interaction with them was always the same scripted performance. I'd greet them at the door in the late afternoon, while the sun was still high enough to feel safe. I'd take their coats and lead them to a guest suite in the East Wing. "The Count will join you for dinner at 9, I would say. Please make yourself comfortable." And that was it. My last words to them. As the sun went down, I became a mute. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. A charming historian, Dr. Alistair Finch, had arrived on a Tuesday. That evening, as I was lighting lamps in the hall, he came downstairs. "My dear," he began, "I was just wondering about the tapestry." He stopped as I looked at him, put a finger to my lips in apology, shook my head, and turned back to my task. He looked bewildered, maybe even offended, but the rule was absolute. The next morning, Dr. Finch was gone. His room was empty, the bed neatly made. His car was gone. He had simply vanished. I mentioned it to the Count, who didn't even look up from his papers. "Dr. Finch's business with me was concluded," he said, his tone final. "It does not concern you." But it kept happening. A poet with eyes like a summer sky, a financier with a booming laugh, a young archaeologist. They'd arrive, full of life. I'd show them to their rooms, I'd obey the rule. And in the morning, they would be gone. No trace left. Just an empty room and the Count's cold dismissal. The rule, I realized with a sickening dread, wasn't about the Count's privacy. It was about the guests' isolation. It was about cutting them off from their last potential ally in this cold, lonely place. It stopped them from asking for help. It stopped them from screaming for it. I once read a morbid story online about a boarding house on a place called Barrow Street, back in 1904, where 41 guests checked in over a summer and were never seen again. Another tale, from a remote inn in 1912, claimed travelers would sign the guest log and simply cease to exist before sunrise. Driven by a chilling premonition, I found the guest register for Blackwood Manor. It was a heavy, leather-bound book in the foyer. I flipped through the pages. Dr. Alistair Finch, Ilara Vance, the poet, Marcus Thorne, the financier. Page after page of names I recognized. And after the last entry, a young woman named Sarah Cartwright who had arrived just last week, the pages were pristine, blank, waiting. My silence wasn't politeness. It was complicity. I was the last person who saw them as free individuals before they became another name in the Count's book. The rule made me an unwitting accomplice to a perfect, repeatable crime. The question, what happens to them, began to change into the far more terrifying question, what am I letting happen to them? The third rule was the most urgent. Lock all windows and bolt all exterior doors at sunset. There are no exceptions. On my first day, the head housekeeper, a stern woman who quit a week later without a word, walked me through the ritual. It was a frantic race against the dying light. The manor had hundreds of windows. Each one had to be secured with a heavy iron latch. Then came the doors, a dozen of them, each bolted with thick wooden beams. At first, I saw it as simple security. The estate was isolated, but there was a panic to it that felt like more than just prudence. I'd start in the east wing as the sun dipped and work my way west, chasing the last rays of light. The click of the last latch, the thud of the last bolt, felt less like securing the house and more like sealing a tomb. I began to understand that the rule wasn't about keeping intruders out. It was about keeping the occupants in. Vampire folklore is filled with weaknesses, and the most prominent is the sun. This ritual wasn't just security. It was preventing the sun from prematurely touching whatever or whomever rested within. But it was also about preventing escape. The windows and doors were open during the day, a taunting illusion of freedom. By the time any guest might feel the first stirrings of fear, their exits were sealed. The house became a cage. The thought was unnerving, like a story by Algernon Blackwood, where a sealed house traps some terrible energy inside. Blackwood Manor was its own vessel, and the things it held were far from ghostly. The true horror of this rule was seared into my memory one cold autumn evening. A new guest had arrived, the young archaeologist, Sarah Cartwright. She had a bright, inquisitive spirit. As dusk fell, I began my ritual. I reached the library, a vast two-story room where Sarah had been reading. The sun was almost gone. I moved to the last open window, a towering arch overlooking the misty woods. As I reached for the latch, I saw her. She was outside on the stone terrace without a coat. Her face was pale with terror. She must have slipped out for some air and found the doors already bolted. She saw me at the window and rushed towards it, her hands pressing against the glass. Her mouth formed a single desperate word: help. My heart stopped. The rule was clear. No exceptions. The sun had set, and the other rule echoed in my mind: do not speak to guests after dusk. I looked at her terrified face, her silent plea, and then at the heavy iron latch in my hand. I could break the rule. I could slide the latch back, open the window, and help her. But what then? The Count's words rang in my ears. No warnings, no second chances. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my compassion. Fear for my job, fear for my safety, fear of him. With trembling hands, I looked away from her pleading eyes and through the latch. The loud, metallic clack echoed in the silent library. I didn't look back. I just turned and walked away, her ghostly image on the now sealed window burning into my mind. The next morning, of course, she was gone. Her room was empty. Her name was just another entry in a book, followed by a series of blank pages. And I knew, with a certainty that left me hollow and sick, that I hadn't just locked a window. I had sealed her fate. I was no longer just an accomplice. I was the one who had locked the final door of the cage. The fourth rule was the most specific and ritualistic. At precisely 9 o'clock each evening, prepare the silver tray with a single decanter of the cellar's red wine and 1 crystal goblet. Place it on the small table outside the library. You are never to question its use. This was the one part of my duties that felt like a ceremony. Every evening at 9, I would descend into the deep, cold wine cellar. The air down there was thick with the smell of damp earth. In a locked cage at the very back was a single large oak cask. This was the source of the red wine. The first time I drew from it, I was struck by its strangeness. It didn't pour like wine. It was thicker, more viscous, with an unnervingly deep crimson color that seemed to absorb light. And the smell. It wasn't fruity or oaked. It had a sharp, metallic tang, a coppery scent I now recognized from the air in the foyer and from outside the Count's forbidden door. I'd carefully fill the crystal decanter, place it on a polished silver tray with a single goblet, and carry it up to the small table beside the library doors. I never saw the Count retrieve it. The next morning, the tray would just be gone, and an empty, gleaming decanter would be waiting for me in the kitchen. I was serving him, but I was kept from the act of consumption. This was intentional. It was another way to manage my complicity, keeping me at a safe distance from the final damning truth. The illusions were impossible to miss. This wine was his sustenance. This nightly ritual was how he fed. The title Count itself began to feel like a cruel joke, twisting a noble title into that of a blood-cursed predator. The breaking point came not with a confrontation, but with a clumsy accident. I was distracted one evening, the face of Sarah Cartwright at the window playing over and over in my mind. As I poured the thick red liquid into the decanter, my hand shook, and a large drop splashed onto the white cuff of my uniform. I went to blot at the stain, but it didn't behave like wine. A wine stain would have immediately soaked in. This drop beaded on the surface for a moment, a perfect, glistening ruby sphere. Its color was too vibrant, too alive. When I dabbed at it, it smeared in a way that was disturbingly organic, and the smell, now so close, was overwhelming. It wasn't wine. It was undeniably, terrifyingly the smell of fresh blood. I stared at the smear on my cuff, my breath caught in my throat. I scrubbed at the stain frantically, washing my hands over and over, but I couldn't get the coppery scent off my skin. I wasn't a maid serving wine. I was a purveyor. I drew the lifeblood from the cask and presented it to him. And the horrifying question that immediately followed was, where did the wine in the cask come from? The guests. The ones who arrived but never left. Their luggage vanished, their cars disappeared, and they were absorbed into the machinery of the house, their vitality decanted into a cask in the cellar. I felt a wave of nausea so profound, I had to grip the stone sink to keep from collapsing. I had been serving my master the very essence of his victims. The final rule on the parchment was the one that had unsettled me from the start. It didn't command me to do something. It commanded inaction in the face of something terrible. It was an open admission that the house was not right. If you hear whispers from the basement, ignore them and continue with your duties. The basement door was at the end of a dark corridor behind the kitchen. It was made of thick, reinforced oak with a heavy iron bolt. I had no reason to ever go down there. The rule itself was a clear warning to stay away. For the first few months, I heard nothing. I told myself it was just another of the Count's eccentricities. Maybe the house had old pipes that groaned. But then, it started. It was faint at first, a low, mournful sound I could dismiss as wind. But as the weeks wore on, the sounds grew more distinct. They were voices, whispers, muffled and distorted by the thick door, but undeniably human. Faint cries for help. Soft, desperate sobs. Sometimes, I would press my ear against the cold wood and almost make out words. Please. So cold. Let me out. This rule was the most sinister of all. It was psychological torture. It acknowledged the horror living in the belly of the house and commanded me to pretend it didn't exist. It was a test of my denial. The whispers were a direct link to the house's victims, hinting at a fate worse than a quick death. A lingering, imprisoned state. The whispers became my personal torment. As I swept the floors, I'd hear a faint cry, and my hands would still. I saw their faces in my mind. Dr. Finch, Elara the poet, Marcus the financier, and most vividly, Sarah Cartwright. One night, I couldn't bear it anymore. The house was dead silent. I crept down the corridor to the basement door, my candle flame throwing wild shadows on the walls. I pressed my ear to the door. For a long while, there was nothing. Then, a single clear whisper, a woman's voice, raw with despair. Sarah. My name is Sarah. Is anyone there? It was her. The archaeologist. The girl I had locked in. She wasn't gone. She was down there. The entire artifice of my employment, my carefully constructed denial, shattered. The 5 rules were a system, a 5-step process of indoctrination. Rule 1 taught me to fear my master. Rule 2 made me a party to abduction. Rule 3 made me a jailer. Rule 4 made me a purveyor of their life force. And Rule 5 was designed to complete my transformation, forcing me to ignore the evidence of my own complicity. I stood there trembling, my hand hovering over the heavy iron bolt. To obey the rule was to let Sarah's voice fade into the chorus of the damned, to finally lose my own soul. To break it was to face whatever horror lay in that darkness, to declare myself an enemy of the master of the house. The whispers weren't just the cries of the lost. They were a call to judgment, and I could no longer pretend I didn't hear them. My fingers, slick with cold sweat, closed around the iron bolt. It was frigid to the touch. The rules screamed in my head. Ignore them. Continue cleaning. My entire life in this house had been defined by willful ignorance. But hearing Sarah's name was a stone cast into the stagnant pool of my denial, and the ripples were now a tidal wave. I pulled the bolt. The sound was obscene in the silence, a loud, grating screech of metal on metal that echoed through the manor's foundations. For a moment, everything went still. Even the whispers from below ceased. I gripped the iron ring handle, took one last shuddering breath, and pulled the heavy door inward. A wave of air washed over me, a scent I now knew intimately. Damp earth, decay, and the cloying coppery tang of blood, the smell of the grave. From the darkness below, a faint pale light emanated, not from a lamp, but from a phosphorescent moss clinging to the stone walls. It lit the top of a steep, winding staircase that descended into blackness. The whispers did not resume. There was only a profound, waiting stillness. I had broken the final rule. I had chosen to see. The 5 rules of Blackwood Manor were never about housekeeping. They were a curriculum of corruption. Each rule I followed was a step away from my own humanity, a test to see how much I would ignore for the promise of security. The Count wasn't looking for a maid. He was cultivating a creature for his eternal predatory machine. He was seeing if he could make me into a monster too. Holding my candle high, its flame a tiny defiant star against the oppressive dark, I took the first step down into the basement. I didn't know what I would find: cages, tombs, or the sleeping forms of the guests I had doomed. I didn't know if the Count knew, if he was waiting for me down there or in the hall behind me. All I knew was that the charade was over. I was no longer an employee. I was a witness. The 5th rule is broken. The question is no longer what the rules are. The question is what you do when you decide to break them. Do you run, hoping to make it past the gates? Do you fight, armed with nothing but a housemaid's courage? Or perhaps, after seeing the truth of such power, do you finally understand the appeal of the offer? To leave the world of the dying and join the endless patient dark?